Welcome to the Perrysburg Podcast, episode 102. I am your host, Perrysburg resident Kim Newlove, and I'm trying to get this episode recorded before I have to go to the fireworks. This podcast is 2 years old this week. I am recording this on Thursday, July 3rd, 2025. Since this podcast is 2 years old this week, this is my 2-year podcast anniversary show. If you are new to this show, welcome. The Perrysburg Podcast is a resource for Perrysburg residents. Whether you're looking to move here, this is day one, or you've been here for a while, this podcast is for you. We talk about what's in Perrysburg and why people like to live here. The Perrysburg Podcast started 2 years ago on July 2nd, 2023. When I started it, I put a 3-year expiration date on it. I don't know if you knew that. Today marks the beginning of the end, so it's the beginning of the third and final year of the podcast. This episode covers 5 topics. They are gratitude, stats, what's coming up in year number 3, what happens when the podcast ends, and lessons learned. Let's start with gratitude. Thank you to my family and friends who have been so supportive of me hosting this local podcast. Sometimes I have needed the house to myself, and my husband has taken our kids out of the house so I can have it quiet. Or sometimes I've needed to skip an opportunity to go somewhere so I can interview a guest or put an episode together. Thank you, family and friends, for understanding that this podcast is a priority for me. To my audience on the podcast players and YouTube, thank you for listening. Thank you for listening to or watching this podcast. I do have a few video episodes on the YouTube channel. The Perrysburg Podcast, by the way, has a global audience. So when I say thank you, audience, no matter where you listen, not just in Perrysburg, but around the world, thank you for taking time to tune in. I'd also like to thank my audio engineering mentor, Don Barnes. I'm sure he doesn't listen to the Perrysburg Podcast, but I really appreciate him showing me how to use my audio engineering software. It was not easy to learn. And I'd also like to say thank you to Dave Jackson from the School of Podcasting. He is my podcasting coach. Thank you so much for your support over the years. Don taught me how to make audio files, and Dave taught me how to start a podcast. It takes a village for a podcaster, I tell you. I don't know how people figure out how to do this themselves. It took me about 30 days to start my first podcast back in 2019, and then only a couple of hours to start this one. It is amazing how much easier this second podcast was to start. Now, if you're wondering what my first podcast is called, the title is The Pharmacist's Voice Podcast, and you can find it at thepharmacist'svoice.com. I started that first podcast back in 2019 for branding, marketing, networking, and relationship building for my business, which is called The Pharmacist's Voice. And this first podcast is still running today, almost 6 years running. We talk about pharmacy topics and careers. In case you don't know this, I am an Ohio pharmacist. I graduated from the University of Toledo College of Pharmacy with my BS Pharm in 2001. I have experience in hospital, retail, compounding, and behavioral health. I am not in clinical practice anymore. I was needed at home. My husband and I have an adult son with autism, and his needs are great enough that I am needed at home. So, in the margins of my life, early in the morning, late at night, and whenever I have time during the day, I work as a medical narrator, an audiobook narrator, an author, a podcast host, and a consultant. What kind of consulting, you might be wondering? I help people start podcasts, narrate audiobooks, and say drug names. Say drug names the right way, by the way. Now, to learn more about me, my business, and my happy clients, check out my LinkedIn profile. I've got a link to it in the show notes. As we wrap up the gratitude portion of this episode, I would just like to say 3 more thank yous. Number 1, thank you for sharing this podcast with others. That is one way that this show has grown. Thank you for sharing it. Thank you to my guests for being on the show. And thank you so much to everyone who has helped me in any way with this podcast. I have had people contribute information that I have then spoken on this podcast and so much more. Thank you to everyone who has not been named. And I have to say a special shout out to Marie Dunn. Marie Dunn is the Public Information Officer for the city of Perrysburg. Marie has been both a wonderful guest over the last 2 years and has connected me to other guests. Thank you so much, Marie. I'd also like to thank the group of people who subscribe to the Perrysburg Podcast's email newsletter. I send out an email newsletter every week to announce each episode. At last count, I have 66 on the list. The list has grown since last year, which I am very happy about. And if you listening today would like to join the newsletter list, there's plenty of room for you. Head over to perrysburgpodcast.com and sign up today. That wraps up the gratitude portion of the show. Thank you again to everyone. Let's move on to stats. As a pharmacist, I love stats. I love information. So as I record this on July 3rd, 2025, I have some stats for you. The Perrysburg Podcast has 5,341 unique downloads on the podcast players. According to the first year podcast anniversary show in 2024, I had 1,470 downloads. The number of downloads has increased by 4,000, about 4,000 in year 2. So we're up to 5,341 at this point. Thank you for listening. There were 28 solo shows in year 2 of the podcast and 24 interview shows. That was very similar to year number 1. The top 3 most downloaded episodes on the podcast players as of July 3rd, 2025, that's today, are episodes 78, 71, and 49. Let me just tell you real quick what those are. Episode 78, this is the most downloaded episode to date, is Prime IV Hydration and Wellness. This is the medical series part 1 of 4. It was my interview with Shannon Kazel and Chelsea Hoensberger. Episode 71 was an episode about crossing the Perrysburg Maumee Bridge with insights from Patrick Birch, the city administrator for Maumee, Ohio. And the third one on the list there, episode 49, was my interview with Joshua Johnson, who I think goes by Josh, so my apologies. Josh Johnson, Executive Director of the Perrysburg Convention and Visitors Bureau, also known as Visit Perrysburg. Just one more number here from the podcast player stats. The 5 countries with the most downloads in reverse order are number 5, Canada, number 4, France, number 3, Sweden, number 2, Spain, and number 1, can you guess it? The USA. Hey, wherever you listen from, thank you so much for listening to the Perrysburg Podcast. Now let's talk about the stats for the Perrysburg Podcast's YouTube channel. The channel has 23 subscribers and 837 views. That's so much less than my other podcast, but it is growing. Unfortunately, I did not make a written record of my YouTube stats from last year, 2024, so I can't compare to this year. But I do remember I was really rooting to get past 20, and eventually I did it. So I know it was less than 20 subscribers last year. Now we've got 23. I did not look at the number of views last year, so I don't know if it has grown exponentially or just doubled. So I don't know. One thing's for sure, though, this podcast is much less popular on YouTube than it is on the podcast players. Now, this is primarily an audio podcast, so that makes sense. Why have a YouTube channel, you're probably wondering. And just as a podcaster, it's good to be where people are listening. So I chose to syndicate the audio-only episodes to YouTube in addition to the video episodes. And just in case you're wondering, what are some of the most popular episodes on YouTube? Well, by far, there are 2 that are the most popular. They are episodes 32 and 22. Episode 32 was my interview with Brian Miller from MaumeeRiverWalleyeRun.com. We talked about walleye fishing. And episode 22 was the walking tour of 101 to 131 Louisiana Avenue with Perrysburg historian Richard Baranowski. All right, that's it. Those are the top two, and that does it for stats. Next, let's talk about what's next for the Perrysburg podcast. When I started the Perrysburg podcast, I had a vision for what I wanted to cover in the first year, like sources of information, census data, parks, places of worship, the Friday night car show, and so on. And I am so glad I covered the Friday night car shows because I just heard that the Oh Dear Diner is up for auction this month in July 2025. Thank you very much to Rick and Dana over at the Oh Dear Diner for everything you have done for making these Friday night car shows possible. But, anyways, just wanted to say that year one, I had an agenda and I didn't get to everything on my list, but I made a lot of progress. Then I created a new vision or a new checklist halfway through year number two. So, like 18 months into the podcast, about halfway through. If you listen to episode 76 of the Perrysburg podcast, you can hear all the details. Basically, I published a checklist of what I'd like to cover before the podcast ends in July of 2026. I'll give you a few examples of what's on that checklist right now. First up is the Faith Community Leader series. That is a series that started in the first year. I added 3 more interviews to it in the second year, and I'll be adding more Faith Community Leader interviews in year 3. I plan to finish the summer reading series this month. By the way, I don't always publish series, but they're super easy to talk about. So the summer reading series started with episode 100. Way Public Library was on the show. Tracy and Alicia were talking about the summer reading programs there at Way Public Library. Then I had Bill Williams in episode 101 talking about his book. I am interrupting the series for today's episode so I can celebrate the second anniversary of the Perrysburg podcast. And then I've got 2 episodes back to back coming up to finish up the series. It is a 4-part series. First up is Denise Phillips from Gathering Volumes Bookstore. She'll be in episode 103 next week. And then Gary Frank's local author will be in episode 104. The medical series that I started in January of this year, so January 2025, will wrap up in October 2025. Part 1 was my interview with Shannon and Chelsea from Prime IV Hydration and Wellness. That's episode 78 if you'd like to go back and listen to it. Part 2 was How to Be a Patient in Perrysburg. That was episode 98. Part 3 will come out in September. That's about pets and healthcare for pets, veterinary care. And part 4 will be about pharmacies in the month of October. The park series wraps up this year with Three Meadows Park. If I have room, though, in my production schedule before the show ends, I will cover Woodlands Park a second time. I know that the art walk has changed. It's been updated since the first time I covered Woodlands Park. Next up, I also hope to include sources of information in year 3. I think I only have one very big one left, and that is the Perrysburg Messenger Journal newspaper. In year 1 and 2, I covered the Buy Nothing Facebook groups, The Buzz Book, Way Public Library, Perrysburg Living Magazine, the Perrysburg Chamber of Commerce, and Visit Perrysburg. So I would also like to interview someone from Welch Publishing about the PMJ, as I call it, the Perrysburg Messenger Journal newspaper. I definitely want to get that in before the podcast ends. I'd also like to cover these 4 attractions in year 3 of the podcast. They are number 1, the 577 Foundation, number 2, the Fort Meigs YMCA, number 3, the Fort Meigs Historic Site, and number 4, the Spafford House Museum. Now, if you listening to this can help me with any of those episodes, please reach out. Resident interviews have been part of the first 2 years of this podcast. They'll be part of year 3 as well. I would really like to interview Doug Pratt. I've said it before in episode 76. I'll say it again. Doug is a retired farmer here in Perrysburg, and he has a farm on Hall Prairie Road that has been in his family for more than 200 years. I would love to talk to him about that farm. I'm a farm girl at heart. I grew up in Pemberville, not on a farm, but my grandpa was a farmer, so I think I could relate to him and I would love to hear his story. Other residents I'd like to interview are Justin and Krista Marchand, who I know from church, Mary Beth Mosier from Nana's Honey, my friend Lionel Brock and or his wife Nikki, and Paul Smithers, who is known around town as Pickleball Paul. I'd love to hear how he got his nickname and what that's all about. I'm also open to other resident interviews. Those are just a few on my short list. Two topics that I am struggling with are sports in Perrysburg and preschools in Perrysburg. There's a lot of information there. There's a lot of preschools in town, and there are a lot of sports available for people of all ages in Perrysburg. I'll figure out a way to cover both. We're going to do it in year 3. This fall, I plan to cover Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts as well. If you can help me out with either episode, please reach out through perrysburgpodcast.com. I would love your help. I have a few public service episodes coming up. I have Lieutenant Brenton Duran from the City of Perrysburg Police Division. He'll be on the show this summer to talk about something called the 9 p.m. routine. This fall, I'm putting together a fire safety episode with the city and township fire departments. And I'll also have an episode coming up this year with the city's income tax commissioner, Steve Bronder. There is no shortage of ideas for the Perrysburg podcast for year number 3. I set out to create the podcast that I needed when I was house shopping for a house in Perrysburg back in 2006, and when I was a new resident back in 2007, and even today. I am a very curious person, and I always am wondering what else is in Perrysburg and why do other people like to live here? Even though I have lived here for about 18 years, I am still curious. So there is no shortage of ideas for this podcast. But there is a sense of urgency, there's a sense of scarcity. I only have about 52 episodes left. So I look forward to publishing the kind of content that my former and current self will enjoy. According to my calendar, this podcast will end on Friday, July 3rd, 2026. What happens after the last episode, you're probably wondering. Good question. I haven't decided yet, so it's kind of hard to say what's next. I have considered some scenarios, though. I may stop publishing this podcast entirely and just keep the website going so that people can go back and listen to the episodes. The podcast players will still work. The YouTube channel will still work, even if I stop this podcast. Or I may adopt a monthly publishing schedule and keep it going. One thing's for sure, I will be done doing weekly episodes. I have given serious thought to another scenario. I should tell you about this. I have thought about asking Marie Dunn at the City of Perrysburg. She's the public information officer. I would like to ask her possibly to co host the show with me. I have told her about that idea when we talked this spring. I needed help getting connected to some guests. And I'm not saying that she's committed to anything at all, but she does know that I am thinking of making her an offer. So, in review, I may stop the podcast, I may change the schedule, I may get a co host. Who knows? But as the day approaches and July 3rd, 2026 is here, of course, I will let you know what's going to happen. When it comes to this podcast, I have always come from a place of service. Once upon a time, little story for you, I thought that I could open up this podcast to sponsors once it ends. I've really been exploring that thought, but the more I think about it, the more I don't feel right about it. I like making money as much as the next person, really, I do. But I want this podcast to be a resource for everyone, not just an advertising opportunity for only those people who can afford to pay me to be featured. In short, I would like to keep the ability to choose my guests and work with people who feel the same way that I do about the mission of this podcast. We talk about what's in Perrysburg and why people like to live here. This podcast is a resource. With that being said, I think we're already getting into the fifth and final part of this episode, which is lessons learned. The biggest lesson that I have learned over the last 2 years of the Perrysburg podcast is that the mission of this podcast is very important to me. This podcast is a resource. We talk about what's in Perrysburg and why people like to live here. This podcast is not for breaking news. It's not a quick attention grab. It's not for people to throw money at me so they can get featured. If you are interested sincerely in being a guest, just fill out the guest application form. I'll have a link to it in the show notes on perrysburgpodcast.com. The guest application form is very thoughtfully put together, and it will help us both figure out if you are right for this show and my audience. Let's move on to another lesson learned. And this is a lesson that I learned with my first podcast, the Pharmacist's Voice podcast, but I can definitely see it with this podcast too. And that is if podcasting were easy, everybody would be doing it. Learning audio engineering, recording software, graphic design, creating show notes, working with media hosting sites and YouTube, and so on. It's all very time consuming. And you have to have a lot of passion to keep it going. I have been very passionate and protective of this podcast since it was started. I really care about the mission and keeping it going and seeing it through. I'm a very responsible person, as you can probably gather, and I am super looking forward to crossing the finish line, finishing the race, and doing it the way that I wanted to. Listen, about podcasting, everything that I talked about, from audio engineering to graphic design to scheduling guests, like all of it, yes, it takes time, but there's learning curves for all of it. So every element of podcasting is a lesson learned for me. And it's probably why I'm so protective of my show. I have worked very hard to launch this podcast, as I'm sure you can tell, and publish quality content regularly. I have not missed a Friday yet, even when I went to Germany last year and I was traveling. I have grown the audience and I have stayed on mission. In fact, I think I've narrowed the focus of the podcast over the last 2 years. This podcast was designed to only have 150 episodes, and I'm sure you can tell I'm trying to make every last one of them count. Just two more lessons, then I'll wrap this up. First, I have met the best kinds of people in this town, from public servants to pastors, residents, business owners, other podcasters, and more. I want to say again, thank you so much to all of the people who have helped me with this podcast or listened to it. I could not have done it without you. The lesson learned, therefore, is that we have the best kind of people in this town. People who care about helping other people with their mission. And the last lesson that I'll talk about is I like writing and publishing. Don't tell my mom, she's a retired English teacher. She'll get way too much satisfaction out of that. But, anyways, I am going to write a book about the Perrysburg podcast when year 3 ends. That was never my intent. I did not start this podcast so that I could write a book about it. But after I wrote my first book, which was about podcasting, it's called Pharmacist Podcaster, a podcast planning guide for pharmacy professionals, I realized I got another book in me about podcasting, and I think I should write a book about local podcasts. Why write a book about local podcasts? You're probably wondering. Well, it's to inspire other small town residents like me to start podcasts too. Truly, if I can do it, they can certainly do it too. I am a pharmacist by training. I never went to school for all of this stuff for podcasting. I had to pick it up piecemeal from mentors and coaches and just by doing it. But if I can do it, other people can do it too. And that's it for lessons learned. Thank you so much for joining me for my second podcast anniversary episode here on the Perrysburg Podcast. I hope you have enjoyed hearing my gratitude list, stats, what's coming up in year 3, what might happen when the podcast ends, and lessons learned. To find the show notes, go to perrysburgpodcast.com. In the show notes, you will find lots of links as always, but you'll find links to the YouTube channel for the Perrysburg Podcast, the guest application form, the newsletter sign up link, a link to my other podcast, the Pharmacist's Voice Podcast, and more. Everything you need is on perrysburgpodcast.com. Just find episode 102. If you know someone who might like this episode, maybe they need some inspiration to start a podcast in another small town, please share this episode with them. And if you like this podcast, come on back. We've got a lot more coming up in 2025. Subscribe to or follow the Perrysburg Podcast on your favorite podcast player and YouTube to get each new episode right when it comes out. Thank you so much for listening today. I'm heading out to the fireworks now. I'll talk to you next Friday.